Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. After months of death and destruction in Gaza, how much room will there be for diplomacy between Palestinians and Israelis? Let's get to the bottom line. In terms of the killing of innocent civilians, Israel's war on Gaza has shocked the world and outpaced most, if not all, conflict zones in the 21st century. Worse than some of the deadliest moments of the U.S. war in Iraq and the U.S. battle against ISIS in Raqqa, Syria. Now most of the 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been displaced, food is in limited supply, and most hospitals have been destroyed. Israel says it's responding to the attack of Hamas on Israel in October that killed hundreds of Israeli soldiers and civilians, and trying to make sure that Hamas can't wage an attack like that ever again. But is its strategy, which has the backing of its patron superpower, the United States, really working? And what happens when the fighting ends and the Palestinians and Israelis have to find a way to live together as neighbors all over again? Today we're talking with David Frum, former speechwriter and assistant to President George W. Bush, currently a writer at The Atlantic magazine, and most recently the author of Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. David, thank you so much for joining us today. Look, this is a painful and horrible subject, which we have all the eyeballs in the world are watching. October 7th, precipitated a response from Israel that brought the Israeli left and right together in response to basically eradicate Hamas. And I was caught by a tweet thread that you tweeted out that began to look at beyond the horror. What do we do when the conflict ends and there is the day after? Tell us what you think are the important features of the day after we need to think about.
I start with this in this matter as a strong supporter of Israel and a strong supporter of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Like many American Jews, I have family on the front lines, and one of my relatives, a second cousin, is in captivity as you and I speak. He is a prisoner of Hamas and probably has been exposed to considerable abuse. So we all have a lot of heart in this story, but we also need our heads, because every war must end. Major combat operations in Gaza will end. I expect and I hope that they will end with tremendous damage to the command structure of Hamas, but that will, as you say, leave behind millions of people and mountains of rubble. How do those people survive? How do they eat? What happens next? And how do you come up with some kind of security regimen to make sure that peace is restored and that people can go about their lives? So there have been a number of ideas floated, and that's where you and I began our conversation. Could Israel reoccupy Gaza? That seems utterly unworkable. Will an international force of some kind arrive in Gaza? I don't think you're going to find many Europeans willing to do that because of the risk of being exposed to terrorist attack from whatever remains of Hamas or other kinds of successor groups. Could a confederation of Arab governments do it? Well, you know better than I how little cooperation there is between Arab governments, how much disagreement. Could the United Nations step in? Well, they have utterly discredited themselves. They have acted as fronts for Hamas through their refugee organizations. There's only one security keeper you can imagine having legitimacy and success, and that is some kind of revived Palestinian Authority. The world has to find a way for a revived and improved Palestinian Authority to re-enter Gaza and assume the responsibilities of governance there.
Now, the Palestine Authority was set up as a temporary transitional authority to move towards a two-state solution. It came as a result of the Oslo Accords. Yeah. There are others like Salam Fayyad, whom I've interviewed recently, who think the PA has lost its legitimacy, lost its role because of the failure to deliver, and thus you need to even go back to the precursor to that, the PLO, and find a new way to get legitimacy. So I find your suggestion really interesting, because are you saying that you can restore the Palestinian Authority and detach it from a two-state horizon?
I think sometimes I worry in the Middle East a lot about solution-ism, that you have a vision of a solution and you then judge yourself by whether you're moving toward that solution when you have an immediate problem. I'm looking at the present, not the future.
And just to our audience, you're worried about housing, water systems, the even most basic necessities, which you lay out in pretty graphic detail in your tweets about really the horrors ahead.
Yes. After previous rounds of violence between Israel and Hamas, 2014 being the most recent big one, there has been a lot of international investment to rebuild Gaza. I think people, and especially friends of the Palestinians, need to be aware that international aid is not likely to be forthcoming in the way it was before.
Because it went into tunnels.
It went into tunnels. So explain to a German taxpayer, explain to an American taxpayer, explain even to people in the Persian Gulf.
Right.
How do you justify writing checks for hundreds of millions of dollars, given the history of past abuse? So there will be emergency aid, humanitarian aid, but it will be much more modest. And so there are solutions that are going to have to come from Gaza. There also are going to have to be, and I understand you've talked to John Bolton about this, there's going to have to be some kind of way that people in the Gaza Strip can exit to go find work and send remittances home. And one of the roles that Persian Gulf governments can have is that they can offer work permits to people willing to try their hands so that they can earn a living, because the aid is not going to flow the way it used to do.
Do you see an end of work permits for Palestinians in Israel? Because a lot of the transfer payments and the economic activity of both the West Bank and Gaza was tied to the Israeli economy. And it really begs the question, will Israel play a role in rebuilding Gaza?
Look, someday this has to be an economic unit. Someday it has to be possible to get on a train in Cairo and get off the train in Damascus with a stop in Jerusalem in between. And this area is too small for so many borders and so much antagonism. But I don't think anytime soon there's going to be a lot of movement from Gaza into Israel. That trust has been forfeited. Because even though the number of people who did the violence is finite, they do seem to have had a lot of information from people who were trusted. So the trust will be hard to restore. Maybe you can imagine some Gazans, if they check out finding work permits in the West Bank, but don't look for that border between Gaza and Israel to be reopened anytime soon. So they're going to have to find work somewhere else, because the aid isn't going to flow the way it used to do.
Where can they go?
There are going to be tremendous labor shortages in the Gulf states. Some will be able to go to Egypt. And as I said, we're talking here about remittances. We're not talking about necessarily relocating whole families. Many of the receiving governments will be reluctant. But if you say, look, here's a group of 100 working-age men who are looking for a 24-month work permit so they can earn a living and send money home to their families, I hope the region, and they speak your language, I hope the region will be open to all of that. But what the place is going to look like, it's not, people are not going to have homes to go back to, or many people will not have homes to go back to, and the water systems are damaged, and the electricity grids are broken, and it will take a long time to restore them, and the resources for that will be coming from inside Gaza, not so much from the outside world anymore.
As you look at things now, and I've interviewed a lot of friends of Israel on this show, a lot of military experts, generals, General Petraeus, others who've said, Hamas, what's not understood is Hamas is not a body of individuals and people. It's an ideology, and the notion that it can be eradicated through this activity is mistaken. We even had the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin saying Israel risks strategic defeat in the course that is going now. So my question to you, and I know it's complicated, is Israel doing the wrong thing at this moment to achieve its objectives of undermining Hamas and creating a different picture?
I'm not a military expert of any kind. I have no idea. What I would also say is it's maybe the wrong question, because there are things that societies are going to do that are inevitable. When Hamas launched the October 7th attacks in such an atrocious way, it did so knowing that no democratic society could fail to respond in a correspondingly large way. It was inevitable that Israel would respond in this way. It was intended. And there just isn't. That's how democracies react when people commit such heinous atrocities against so many of their citizens, especially targeting women and children in the way that Hamas did. What will happen, though, when the major combat operations come to an end, as they soon will, politics in Israel will begin to resume. And there
what will that look like, you think?
Well, that will look like is demands in the street for accountability for Netanyahu to depart, questions about the security establishment.
So there will be a reckoning.
There will be a reckoning, and there are going to be all kinds of other interesting shifts. Some people are going to be, one of the major things that happened inside Israel during this conflict was a surge of support for the state from Palestinian Israelis, Arab Israelis. You saw these polls that showed an interest, a rise in identification with the state. Now, some will say that was driven by fear more than loyalty. But there has certainly been no reaction within Israel of any kind of security threats from Palestinian Arabs who have Israeli passports. I know a lot of Israelis, Jews, and Arabs who say, what did they get from that? Where were the demonstrations of appreciation for loyalty to the state? That's going to be a major divide. Meanwhile, there were all kinds of settlers who, in Israel's Jewish settlers in the West Bank, who in Israel's hour of need intensified conflict with their Arab neighbors as if to open up yet one more front at exactly the time when that front was least needed. So there will be disputes.
I mean, a lot of people are very, very worried about the West Bank right now,
Yeah.
as an escalation, about settler provocations there. You and I have both been in recent meetings where I think some government officials feel confidence that that is going to somehow be controlled and reeled in by the Israeli government. But do you have that confidence? Because that's one area where I worry, what are the blind spots we're not seeing right now? Yeah. And if that conflagration were to hit the West Bank, you know, that would be really disturbing escalation of this.
I don't see this as a prediction. You said, what does politics look like? So one of the issues in politics will be what happens to Netanyahu. One of the issues in politics will be who is to blame for this security and intelligence failure. And another issue in politics will be those who say, we owe something to the Israeli Arabs, and those who say, no, we owe protection to the settlers. And those two groups within Israeli society will argue intensely. And I think there's going to be a reckoning as well with the role of the ultra-religious. There has been an effort to pull the ultra-religious into the military. Israel's security needs after this war will be greater because Israel will now have to watch not only the north, where it always watches, not only Gaza, it will have to have an eye to other kinds of regional threats. The idea that there's this large group of people who exempt themselves from the normal responsibilities of citizenship because of their ultra-religiosity, that's going to be questioned. So you're going to have a lot of politics inside Israel. I have no idea how it will work itself out. But the idea that there is an Israel, I mean, Israel has been united in its reaction against Hamas, but there are these other questions, and there will be important debates. And one of the things that people who watch this program, one of the things that they need to bear in mind is their own agency in all of this. The signals that Israel gets from its neighbors, the signals that Israel gets from the region, will also have important effect. If we can move toward resumption of normalization with Persian Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, that opens more space for a less fearful Israel to behave in ways that empower the most generous elements in Israeli society. If Israelis feel more fearful, you empower the least generous elements in Israeli society.
You don't call for a two-state solution in that case, which some are saying may be dead, some are saying is the only option. But as you think about what you just said about taking pressure off Israel, decreasing the toxicity of the moment, looking at a Saudi normalization, do you see an opportunity there?
Again, I want to warn against solutionism. I just think you need to take one step at a time. And I think all of those hopes that were felt so intensely in the 1990s, they are so much farther away than they were. But there are things that you can do today. And I would emphasize, as I did in that tweet, dignity for Arab citizens of Israel, respect, equality, and having a vision of at least there has to be someday economic integration, from the river to the sea, economic integration, and beyond the river to the sea, economic integration. As for the Saudis, the Biden administration may be kidding itself on the speed at which this is happening, because the Saudis, I think, have indicated they want to play in American politics. They want to help Republicans. They want to help Donald Trump. They want to hurt Joe Biden. I find it hard to imagine that they would hand such a major diplomatic victory to President Biden in 2024. Perhaps if President Biden wins re-election and they have to deal with him in 2025, it will happen then. I would, October 7th, no October 7th, I would not have expected a breakthrough in the coming year. But the Saudis want it for their own purposes. The whole region has to be demilitarized, has to be normalized. And so long as there's animosity toward Israel, this will never be a normal region of the world. And the economic prospects that the Saudis imagine, the Saudi leadership imagines, they envision economic development, social normalization within an authoritarian political context. Well, it's hard to do that. It's hard to maintain the authoritarian politics and the normal economy at a time of intense competition with your neighbors. In order to make that formula work, and it's a tough formula, you need peace.
How would Donald Trump have managed this differently, do you believe, than Joe Biden? Joe Biden is suffering in the polls in part because of antipathy among young Democrats about how he's dealing with Israel-Palestine right now and what they see as being Joe Biden as being more pro-Israel than they're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Would it be ironic that Joe Biden loses the election because of that loss of support to Donald Trump over this crisis?
Donald, I don't believe that really will happen. And I think that when you look more closely at those polls, you see Biden also confronts people to his right, Democrats to his right, who say he has not done enough. And the people who are most angry at Biden about his support for Israel are those who are the least likely to vote. You know, one of the questions that they asked these young people is, did you vote in 2020? And among those who said, no, they did not vote in 2020, they are much more likely to be on the pro-Palestinian side than among those who did. So if you're a professional politician, you say, if you don't vote, I'm interested in your opinion as a fellow citizen, but
you don't matter.
You don't matter. The people who vote, they matter. How would Donald Trump have handled this? It's unpredictable. I mean, you know, Trump responds to very personal economic incentives. The Saudis have enriched his family, and since he left office, they've enriched his family even more. So I think his first call would be to them. He is very interested in some of the most reactionary elements in Israeli society. He would have listened to them. But because no one should ever feel secure about any possible response, it is very possible that Donald Trump would have done something radically unthinkable. And with Biden, I've spoken to diplomats from the region, and they have said they miss Trump because with Trump, if you paid the right people, you could have a highway to the very innermost circle, and then the president you could prevail on him. If you got him in the right mood, he might. Whereas with the Biden people, there's always all this process, there's this bureaucracy, they're very concerned with being consistent. It's very difficult to work with them. But you know what? Predictability is good.
And Biden has that.
Biden is the most predictable politician probably in the United States, if not the world.
Well, let me ask you about one of the things that's beginning to bruise is some states, and maybe this is a cop-out with some of the hardcore necessities you're talking about the day after in Gaza. Some states are talking about recognizing Palestinian statehood. You've got Obama officials beginning to write New York Times op-eds saying, hey, we need to recognize Palestine as a state. Does that help get us anywhere?
No. Think of yourself living on a street in Gaza. You've lost whatever home you had. There's no potable water. You're drinking water that's maybe going to make your kids sick. There's electricity unevenly fluctuating. You're terrorized by these gunmen who there are bombs going off. And the idea that somebody you've never met gets to drive to the UN in a big car with a flag on the hood. You need water. You need drinking water, and you need it right now. You need the power to be on. You need the bombs to stop going off. You need the gunmen to be sent away. And then you need to have some hope that the working age men in your family can earn some kind of living and get some kind of money to put a roof back over your head.
There are ruminations that Iran may have a breakout year next year, that it may, in fact, become a fully fledged 10th major nuclear power in the world, violating non-proliferation agreements, et cetera. But it will be there, it will be out there. As you look back at that, and part of the issue here is to what degree are we looking at a proxy conflict between different parts of the Middle East, the Iranians versus us and the Saudis, and maybe it is a mistake to look at it in that way, but it does talk about what comes next in the region and how it could get much, much worse and more complex, particularly for U.S. interests.
Well, when President Obama negotiated the agreement with Iran, I criticized it because I said the benefits to Iran are at the front of the deal, and the burdens to Iran are on the back of the deal. Who negotiated this? When President Trump then said, I want to cancel the deal, I said, you can't cancel the deal because the benefits to Iran are already paid. The problem with the deal is the thing that also makes it dangerous to cancel. The benefits are front-loaded, the obligations are back-loaded, so once the deal has been unfortunately signed, you don't want to blow it up because then you blow up your hope of getting your part of the deal, which is all in the back end. But they did blow it up, and then here we are. I think that if the Iranians take these actions, not understanding the potential for violence in 2024, you have an Israel that has lost many inhibitions because of the October 7th attack. You have American resources that have been redirected into the region because of the October 7th attack. You have a new solidarity between the United States and Israel. For all the talk you see in the papers about criticism, my memory stretches back to 73 and even as a boy to the Six-Day War. Never has the United States given Israel as much security permission as it's given now. This war is soon going to be at the 3-month mark of intense military action, intense violence. That didn't happen in 1982, when Israel went into Lebanon after the PLO. They did not get 3 months of permission. In 1973, Israel did not get 3 months of permission. Israel has 3 months of permission, and not only from the United States, but from Great Britain and the European Union as well. Israel has never been allowed this much scope to act. And if I were the Iranians, I would take that scope extremely seriously.
And just finally, David, I'm interested in where this all goes, and I want to respect the fact that you're opposed to solutionism and grand plans, but what you've laid out for the Palestinian Authority, the responsibilities and the burdens it's going to have to govern in really a horrible postmodern situation with millions of people. Is there a way to think about this, again, to get the Palestinians to be supportive of what you're suggesting, that this may one day lead to an end to the occupation?
I look for hope to the Irish model. So the way peace arrived in Northern Ireland was that there was this intense conflict with all kinds of cultural and historic loyalties. And the Good Friday Accords created a dynamic whereby if you were a Protestant British citizen living in Northern Ireland, you could have a British passport. And if you were a Catholic British citizen living in Northern Ireland, you could have an Irish passport. If you wanted to think of yourself as British, you could. If you wanted to think of yourself as Irish, you could. And then the border between Northern and Southern Ireland went away as long as Britain remained in the European Union. And you had this moment where the identity you carry in your head and on your papers could be blurred into the identity that existed in legal reality. So I look to that, when I imagine what could the Middle East look like? I would look to a world in which the Jews were citizens of Israel, and they might live next door to somebody who is a citizen of Palestine, and maybe they voted for different mayors and different lists, but there was one economic unit that traded freely with other elements in the region. That the solution to this problem is to make the borders matter less, and to make individual identities and individual loyalties less connected to legal and sovereign structures. Putting national boundaries into the Middle East has not brought peace since the end of the Ottoman Empire. So obviously the Ottomans aren't coming back, but that kind of borderless space that existed while the Ottomans were there, that is what the Middle East is going to have to be if it's going to live in any kind of peace.
Well, writer and commentator David Frum, I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Always a pleasure to talk.
So what's the bottom line? The outrage created by the war on Gaza is going to last for generations in the Middle East and all around the world. At the same time, the Gaza Strip is going to have to be rebuilt sooner or later. After all this death and destruction wrought by Israel, has it invalidated itself from governing Gaza and the Palestinians? U.S. officials say the Palestinian Authority is, quote, the only show in town, as impotent as it may appear now. So will anyone really suddenly help create a reborn, cleaned up Palestinian Authority with greater resources, power, and support from all parties, particularly the U.S., but also Israel and the Arab neighborhood? And has anyone bothered to ask the Palestinian people what they'd like to have? It still looks like there are zero alternatives out there. And that's exactly why the international community needs to focus on what can be done rather than what can't. And that's the bottom line.